Welcome to OIC, the podcast that shines a light on innovation and discusses the technology currently being developed at the University of Alabama. Join us as we chat with UA's top inventors, uncovering the inspiration behind their technologies and how they plan to make an impact on society. And now, from the Office for Innovation and Commercialization in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, your host, Caitlin May.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do?
Sure. So I am a professor of chemical and biological engineering here at the University of Alabama. I've been here since 2010. Before this, I was at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I got my PhD in chemical engineering. I was a postdoc there for a little bit. Prior to that, I got my bachelor's degree at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, also in chemical engineering. And I fell into this position. Honestly, I don't think when I was an undergrad I ever intended to be a professor.
None of us ever do.
No. And then somewhere along the way, I'm like, hey, I'm pretty good at research. Maybe, and I like how academic life is and research. So maybe I'll give this a try. And man, that was 11 years ago already since I started. Time flies.
Yeah.
Can't believe it's been that long. Anyway, so
I'm dying to hear about them. I know you have so many patents, an impressive number. How many is it again?
I have 11 patents issued, and I don't know how many more are pending. 5 or 6 or something like that.
Like academic by day, entrepreneur by night.
Yeah. I try. I think you kind of have to be always thinking about, and I think that's part of chemical engineering in general. Is we're kind of sitting between chemistry and engineering and taking products and ideas from a small scale to something that can be used or scaled up at least.
So would you mind telling us about some of those patents?
Sure. So a lot of things that I've done at the University of Alabama, we've got a number of patents that are issued on what we call ionic polymers. And these are polymers that have charges in the backbone, and they're really interesting, right? So a lot of them are they're similar to the conventional high performance polymers that we know. So take, for example, Kevlar. Right? We use a structure very similar to Kevlar, but we can add some positive charges to its backbone and it gets very different properties when we do that. So it's still very tough, but it can also be 3D printed. It can be, it heals itself. That's a really remarkable property of this stuff that I can.
Wait, it heals itself?
Yeah, it heals itself. So let's say I could stick a knife or a needle or through it, or I can cut it. And I can it'll either the hole will close up or it will fuse itself back together.
Oh, wow. That's wild.
Yeah. So it's really cool. And that's a material, a class of materials we've invented that NASA's interested in, Department of Defense has been interested in it. People, and outside my area, I know biomedical space has been interested in these things.
Yeah, that's what came to me was the potential for that in the medical realm.
Yeah. So anyone that sees it's like really impressed, and it happened by accident. It's like,
did it really?
Yeah, it totally happened by accident because we were making some other materials which are called polyimides. It sounds very similar, but imide with an I, and so the chemistry is very similar. So I told my students one day to make polyamides with an A, and they showed it to me, and I said, "Wow, this is nothing like the previous material, the polyimide." I was like, "It's really tough," and then we started banging on it. And beating it, and it's like this stuff is just like resisting it. You could stick like I said, a needle in it or a knife in it, and it'll close itself up. Or if you stretch it, it'll come back. It could smash it, and it's just a remarkable material that happened by accident. And
wait, did the students mess up and like that was the accident?
No.
Okay, no. So you just came up with this idea to do something new, and it ended up being this beautiful thing.
At no point did we say like, oh, if we mix this and this together, it's going to be something really cool. We just figured
you're just playing
different properties. Yeah, then it would just behave differently. Yeah. And the kind where we work in my lab, and just what I'm interested in is kind of like the interface of like what we call building blocks. So building polymers from small molecules, which we call building blocks. And then how do you structure those building blocks ultimately to make a polymer that does something you want?
Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of like picking and choosing things and saying, this will give us this property, whether that's a mechanical property, a thermal property, a diffusion property. A lot of what we do is look at gases moving through polymer membranes. But in this case, it was unexpected that if you put all these things together, the properties become very weird.
Hmm.
So we've made some really cool materials that I
Yeah,
think
that's super
really,
intriguing.
yeah, and I think they could very well be scaled up. We're
Well,
looking at
I
some
was
of that
gonna
now.
ask, like, are there
Mhm.
specific applications that you're inventing, like thinking towards that specific domain or field, or are the possibilities kind of endless?
Yeah, it is kind of endless. I mean, some things, for one, NASA is interested in self-healing polymers, not so much because we're going to poke them and reuse them. I mean, that's true, but it's the idea that when you're in space, let's say I have to make something, but then I'm done with it, right? I need to
Yeah.
make the next thing. I'm only going to have a limited amount of material. So self-healing polymer is pretty cool because when I'm done with object X, I can chop it up,
Yeah.
put it back into my 3D printer and make object Y, right? So I can reuse that material. Whereas a lot of our conventional polymers, you can't really, again, it sounds like recycling because it is, you can only recycle them so many times before they don't work well
Sure.
anymore because you've degraded the polymer chains. Also just self-healing, again, biomedical type applications, or even one project that we're involved with, which I had no idea I'd ever be doing, is making surgical training aids for the Army.
Okay.
So again, you think about, it's very much like movie makeup, right? Where you have a replica of what a bullet wound is going to look like, right? Because the Army's interested.
Yeah.
And so how do you train a doctor ahead of time to react, to understand what a bullet wound is going to look like, and almost get them ready for that in reality? So again, these things are made almost like movie makeup, and the problem is they're not very dynamic, right? You kind of like see it and you can touch it. That's about the extent you can do with it. So the idea of this company we work with is to make self-healing wounds, that something can happen and that it can change, it can bleed, it can smell.
Wow. So it almost
But,
responds.
but when I'm done with it, I can seal it back up and the next person gets to be trained with it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
There's
So again,
I see so much potential for that.
yeah. And that's not, again, believe me, it's not a project I ever thought I'd be involved with.
Isn't that funny how it works out that way, though?
Yeah. It just,
How did you get
things,
involved in it?
it was actually an undergrad student in my lab. His dad works for the company.
Oh,
And he's like,
wow.
Dad, we've got this really cool material in the lab, and I think this might be useful. Like maybe you guys could look into this and get a grant together to like study how this could be used. And one thing led to another, and yeah,
The undergrad
we
get A in the
were.
class. I mean, that's
Well, he was doing
empty extra
research.
credit right there. You got to research.
Yeah, I really do need to thank him. But no, he was doing research in the lab.
Okay.
I think he may have been in my class as well, but he was actively doing research in the lab at that time, and he made the connection with his dad, who then put me in touch with the owners of the company. Yeah, super cool.
So I know you've got tons of other projects. What's another
Mhm.
one?
So one area we've been really successful in getting research funding for recently is in plastic recycling.
Okay.
So I'm sure this, COVID has obviously been the main story, but underneath that, certainly the last couple of years has been a story about plastic waste and how we're kind of at a tipping point where things are really bad and we're making so much plastic waste and we don't know what to do with it, and recycling can only do so much. And I don't mean to sound bleak or whatever, but when you put stuff in the recycling bin, there's no guarantee it ever actually gets recycled,
Right.
So we just don't put enough value on plastic the way we do on like aluminum. Almost all the aluminum you ever have used has probably been at least partially recycled already. I mean, it's like an infinitely recyclable material.
Right.
But plastics really aren't, because the more times, as I mentioned earlier, the more times I put them through an extruder, the more times I heat them, they start to degrade. And so my, plastic water bottles that I put into the extruder, I keep recycling them. After a couple times, that's not going to make a good water bottle anymore. So I have to find some other use for it. And that's what we'd call downcycling, right? Where I've damaged the polymer. And so now it can't be a water bottle. It's got to be a vase, right? Or I'm going to put a plant in it and use it to start my garden or something like that. So what we've been interested in, we've been funded to do this by the National Science Foundation, is what we call upcycling. And so that's taking a plastic waste and making something better or more valuable out of it. And when you think about it, the plastic we use and touch every day, your PET, your polypropylene, your polyethylene, PVC, this all came from oil in one form or another, right? So there's a lot of valuable hydrocarbon resources tied up in that plastic waste. So we can get at that through chemistry. So we can modify those plastic wastes to make them something more valuable. So let's say I could take PVC waste and I can do some reactions on it and I can turn it into a rubber, or like a wetsuit would be a great example, right? I could turn it into something that's insulating and flexible. Or what's even more interesting is that I can do chemistry on these materials and I can break them back down into their smallest pieces. So I could take a polymer plastic waste and I can make effectively, again, to use the term, small molecules from it. And maybe I can then use those to make something more interesting. Like I could convert, I could break down PVC and get some building blocks back that now I can make nylon. And nylon is a much more valuable material because I'm trying to preserve or recover those hydrocarbon resources that are tied up in the plastic waste.
Okay.
So that's a big effort. It's not just me, it's like 5 or 6 other people in my department. And chemistry right now, we've got 2 grants that total about $4 million from National Science Foundation. So yeah, we're hitting that really hard.
Yeah, that's no small accomplishment.
No, thanks. And you talk about aha moments or whatever. All this, my work with the PVC came from an experiment I did actually when I first got here with my first grad student. We were just playing in the lab, and I was like, well, let's see if we can stick this molecule in PVC, and it didn't work the way we wanted it to, and we got this weird rubber out of it, and we just kind of said, well, that's not going to work, and we stuck it on the shelf. Okay. And then 7-8 years later, whenever we started these proposal opportunities came up, like, well, I've got this idea about I was playing with PVC once and it didn't go quite right, but maybe that's actually a good example of upcycling. And we wrote the proposal and we got it funded.
Oh,
and then and again, it's just like total accident that 10 years later led to a $2 million grant.
Gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah, I know.
Like,
so you always have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, you just always have to keep things in the back of your mind. Like even your failures might be useful someday.
Well, so what's your best case scenario for all of these projects you have going on and your wildest dreams? What do you hope that they accomplish?
Well, go back to entrepreneurship. I very much hope to see these things turn into companies or products.
Yeah.
I had actually started a company when I was a postdoc at the University of Colorado. It's called Ion. It was called Ion Engineering. It's now called Ion Clean Energy. And that company, that was 2008. So we're coming up on about 13 years. It's still in business.
Congrats.
Yeah, thanks.
That's so hard to get them to have kind of longevity. That's huge.
I know. And I have my role and it's very passive these days, but one of the founders of that, and that was based off of a technology that we had on capturing CO2 from power plants. Okay. And they've been very fortunate to be funded well by the Department of Energy for quite a while. And I've been involved in some of those projects here as well as a research component. And I have a small company. I've done some mobile apps for iPhones and things in the past. So it was a former student here. We started just a little business to manage that. Awesome. So I'm not new to starting companies, and I'd love to see these things become companies in them of themselves. I think we've got 3 or 4 really good things going in the lab that could be products, if not like whole companies and processes themselves.
What has it been like working with others here at UA? What has that experience been like? Yeah,
I can't think. There's a couple faculty members, and of course the students, right? It's the students that do the work day to day. Most of my patents involve students and postdocs, right? They're the ones who really are doing the work and making it happen. It's just kind of helping guide them and steer them to understand like the inventions that they have that I'll take credit for, and some of the conception, but they're the ones also making it work and understanding it. So I can't thank the students enough, but there's too many of them. Maybe just to give a shout out. Maybe editing this.
They'll be the et al.
Right, but there's 2 people I really want to thank. There's more than that, but in the time I've been here, Heath Turner, who works in chemical engineering. He's entirely computational simulations. So he doesn't actually his group doesn't do any lab work, but what they do for us, and with us, I should say, is help us understand at a molecular level the properties of materials using simulations, which then you can extract a lot of information that you could not get otherwise. Always not directly, right? I mean, the measurements we make, you can't necessarily zoom in on a molecule or a site in your polymer and see what's happening. So they can really help us visualize and understand, and then they give us guidance like, hey, do this next or try this next because you might be able to make it better. Yeah. And then Paul Rupar in the chemistry department, he is a PhD in polymer chemistry, and Paul's awesome. He's my neighbor. He lives 2 houses down.
Oh, really?
So it's really great. Yeah, we have a great relationship because we can see each other all the time and just kind of like chat really quick and catch up. But yeah, Paul, he's a real scientist. You know, I'm an engineer. I kind of like learns this as I go, and I feel like Paul is the expert, and I have to ask him a lot of questions. Like, I'm not crazy when I say this, am I? And also, and again, not to exclude one other person, he's relatively new, Stephen Weinman, in chemical engineering. He's really an energetic new faculty member, and he brings a lot of ideas and concepts to me. It's like, hey, how can we address this? And he was the one who actually led the first polymer upcycling grant that we got last year.
Wow.
Yeah, so it wasn't for his energy, I don't know that we've been able to put that one together. So yeah, he's been really enthusiastic and going after these opportunities, and it's a nice team, and we've got some really good relationships and colleagues, and that's not everyone, but those are the 3 I just want to.
Oh, I'm sure we can go on for like hours listening to people. That's fantastic though. So with your team, what is your next step?
Oh man, we're at various stages, right? I mean, some of these inventions are pretty close to where, a NASA, we could make material, and I don't want to say we're not at a company stage yet. We're at a stage where we're making real prototypes and devices. And, with the NASA work with the self-healing polymer, we're actually starting to 3D print that, so we're going to be able to make real products, not just kind of like lumps of polymer that we kind of smash or whatever. We have them actually print it. So that's really exciting. We've also got some work in green solvents, which I think is getting close to commercialization. So we've made some small molecules from glycerol, which is a byproduct of biodiesel. And so it's just a waste. There's a lot of glycerol out there, and it's hard to find enough uses for it. So we've been doing some reactions on glycerol to make some useful molecules that I think could just be like what we call green solvents. So replacing petroleum products with at least partially bio-derived. Yeah, so they should be safer.
Fuel oriented.
Yeah, well, I mean, it'd come from
petroleum products in general.
Yeah. So I mean, you're making these as a byproduct of biofuels.
Yeah.
And so it's like, all right, it supports biofuels, but also glycerol is kind of a natural, safe product to begin with. It's in a lot of hair care products, conditioners, cosmetics, right? You could eat it to some degree. I know they feed it to animals, so it's very safe. And so we think by functionalizing glycerol, we can make really safe alternatives to conventional solvents. Yep. And then the polymer upcycling work, I mean, that's still a ways away, but everything early on is really promising, at least in the lab, right? But the economics of the long term, we still have to figure that out, right? That how do I one, get all this plastic waste in the first place, right? It's difficult. And then is everything we're doing with it, how much is that what does that translate into if I want to sell those products? Is it a competitive product, or will it be, and again, marketing wise, right? If it's, will people pay more for something that's made from plastic waste because it's helping the environment? Right? That's one of those questions, right? Is what you're doing, ultimately you have to just, in a market-based economy, we have to be competitive. But again, from a business question, will people just pay more because it's a green product, right? And so these are fun things to think about.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
curious what your experience has been like bridging that gap between academia and the public and getting your research or your product out into the public sphere. Has it been difficult to kind of break down those super, super complex things to something that's approachable and engaging to the public? What is the response been like in that path?
Yeah, I mean, it is, going back to the CO2 capture company and the work, we still do some of that work, obviously. People get that. I mean, that's been in the news for a while, and you can tell them I'm working on this, and a lot of people get excited about it. Now they may not understand and don't maybe need to know all the nuts and bolts and how this works. But I mean, yeah, these kind of things that everyone can relate to are easier, right? So if I say I'm recycling or upcycling plastics, okay, like that's one I think we can appreciate.
Yeah.
But when you get into some more other thing, like the self-healing polymer, it's kind of like, what does that mean but if you can see it and touch it and play with it, that's where you can win people over.
You're sure. Show them, don't tell them, right?
Yeah, exactly. And my collaborator at NASA, who I also want to thank too, Dr. Enrique Jackson, he's been a big champion for us in working with NASA. And we give him materials and he brings it around NASA and he shows everyone. And so he's a really great advocate. And so, yeah, again, a lot of times you have to touch something, feel something in order to appreciate it. But then we talk about green solvents from glycerol. If I show it to you in a jar, it looks like it's water.
What is this?
Right. Or it smells like acetone or ethanol, right? It's like, okay, what can that really do? And that's a harder thing to explain. Like, no, I'm deriving this from plants and it's helping support biodiesel, right? I mean, that's a little bit, so the more in your face or touchy-feely or daily life kind of connection you can make with it, I think it's easy. But the more nuanced we get, no matter how big of an impact it might have, it's like, it still looks like a bottle of water at the end, right? So that's a little trickier.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and telling us about the awesome work that you're doing. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Caitlin. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to OIC, a podcast from the University of Alabama's Office for Innovation and Commercialization in Tuscaloosa. Tune in next time for more inspiring innovators and their impactful inventions. Until then, stay curious, keep learning, and roll Tide.